I'm Leslie Kenton. I grew up in an extraordinary family. Very funny, very tragic, but wonderful. My parents always insisted that I call them by their first names, Violet and Stanley. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who actually ruled the family, was known as Mom to everyone. And there's one other character that's very, very important, and that's Tuffy. And Tuffy was a huge, rough collie, so big that when he put his paws on my father's shoulders, and my father was 6'4.5", he could look over his head. Okay. It's Friday, May 30th, 1947, Memorial Day weekend. We woke at dawn and drove from Hollywood to Balboa for a few days' vacation on the beach. Violet, Stanley, Mom, me, and Tuffy, since I refused to leave my dog behind. 3 hours down the road, we passed a sign. It said, "Boats for sale." "Boats, hey, let's buy a boat," Stanley says, turning the car around. "Great, a boat," I echo. "Can we do it now?" "Sure." The boats beneath the garish sign turned out to be 35-foot steel craft cabin cruisers, as ugly as sin. Made of heavy-gauge steel, they're lethal weapons in the hands of amateurs. "How much are your boats?" Stanley asks the little man. The guy obviously doesn't allow dogs on his moorings, but he's being forced to make an exception for Tuffy since he hopes to sell us one of his tubs. I don't remember what the boats cost, several $1,000s anyway, probably equivalent of what you pay for a good car nowadays. "We'll take one," says my father. "That one with the white line around it." "Oh, yes," my mother says. "I do like the white line, Stanley." "Good choice," the little man replies. "When would you like to pick it up?" "Now." "Now?" "Yeah." No. She has to be weather stripped. She should be fitted with an automatic bilge. You'll need a dinghy and bedding and dishes and life jackets. And how about next week?" "Nope. We want to take her out this afternoon." "How are you going to pay for it?" the salesman says, feeling he's beginning to lose his ground. "Cash," says my father. Fearing the loss of the sale, the man shakes his head. "Okay, I'll do the best I can. Give me 2 hours." "Right," says my mother. "That'll give us time to buy what we need and get back here after lunch. Let's see. Food, dishes, paper cups. Did you say life jackets? We've got Tuffy's dog dish and some canned food. Leslie, get me a pad of paper from the glove box so I can make a list." First we went to the bank. Stanley withdrew a big wad of $100 bills. The customers and cashiers stared at him as though he were a bank robber. I stood by, delighted with the thought that my father might be considered a bank robber. From there we headed for the ship's chandlers, where everything looked inviting. My parents picked out captain's hats, life jackets, ropes. I don't think Stanley was quite sure what ropes were for, but he knew that you were meant to have ropes on the boat, so he bought a big selection. Then, like invading hordes, we descended on a food store, coming away with enough food to fill 3 galleys. We piled it all into the back of the car together with the ropes and life jackets, bedding, potato chips, beer, whiskeys, paper cups, a waterproof jacket for Mom, and we headed back to the boat store. Mom is not at all sure we're making the right decision in buying this boat. "Stanley," she says, "you're bound to get seasick," she says. "What do you know about boats anyway?" she says. "Don't worry," he says. "We'll figure it out." We set out just after 2 p.m. on our way to Catalina Island, 26 miles off the shore of California. The weather is as smooth as glass, as is the water. By 3:30 p.m., the swells have risen to 10 feet high, and the boat is swamped. Dressed in their new marine gear and captain's hats, Violet and Stanley try desperately to clear the water that by now is flooding the deck. They use whatever they can find, a bucket, a pitcher, their cupped hands, and all the while they're vomiting into the wind. It took them a long time to figure out which side was the right side of the boat to throw up over, so the vomit didn't return to cover them. Before long, Tuffy vomited too, all over me. Meanwhile, Mom sat stone still at the table in the galley, holding on and shouting, "Stanley, for God's sake, stop rocking the boat." We didn't drop anchor in Catalina until 2 a.m. My parents swore they'd never spend another night on the damned boat. We agreed to head home first thing in the morning. In the end, we did no such thing. What none of us knew then was that the boat bug had already bitten us bad, and there is no escape once it gets hold of you. At 5 a.m., we wake to a terrible crash. "Oh my God, we're sinking," screams Mom from her bunk. Despite her fat body, my grandmother has the reaction time of a race car driver. She leaps to the galley floor where Tuffy is lying curled up in sleep. Unprepared for the impact of her weight, he barks furiously. Stanley stumbles from his own bed on the galley table and staggers up on deck. Violet follows him. Still reeling from hours of vomiting, bilging seawater, and cleaning up messes, they are unprepared for what they meet. With the coming of dawn, the tides had changed, and our boat, which Stanley anchored in the bay, had swung round to face in the opposite direction. In the process, it had crashed into a magnificent 60-foot Chris craft, slicing a gash in her hull, which in early morning light looked like a gaping chasm. Stanley grabs a gaffling hook, turns the boat round, and pushes with all his might against the other hull in an attempt to keep it from happening again. Meanwhile, a handsome 60-year-old man with silver hair looking like the mane of a lion emerges from his boat's cabin, wrapped in a paisley dressing gown, and in a resonant voice which perfectly matches his mane, and with an upper-class English accent, he asks, "Goodness, are we drifting?" My parents were mortified. "It's all our fault," Stanley said. I'm really sorry. This is our first boat trip," Violet said. "We didn't know we had to anchor the boat at both ends," Stanley said. "I hope we haven't caused terrible damage." "Not to worry," the man said. "She has a thick hull. She can take a few knocks." "Oh, really, we're so sorry," said my mother. "Can I ask you something?" said Stanley. "Of course." "How are you supposed to secure a boat?" "Secure a boat? Well, you need to have plenty of space between her and any other boat nearby so she can swing with the tide." "Oh." "I say, as dawn is upon us, why don't you join us for breakfast? In, say, half an hour? My wife fries up a splendid kipper. I'll see if I can wrestle up a bottle of champagne to go with the orange juice." Neither Violet nor Stanley had ever heard of a kipper, but after all the vomiting, they were ravenous enough to eat anything. Mom, Violet, and Stanley put on the driest clothes they could find, climbed into our dinghy for the first time, and rowed the several yards necessary to board the man's boat. Tuppy and I stayed behind. We'd not been invited. Besides, orange juice mixed with champagne sounded yucky. That was 6:30 in the morning. By noon, they had still not returned. Meanwhile, Tuffy and I had chomped our way through dog biscuits, potato chips, and the revolting sailor's biscuits bought at the ship's chandler's. Finally, in a haze of spiked orange juice and smoked fish, they'd apparently forgotten us, in my strongest voice, I shouted to them. Stanley shouted back, "Put on your bathing suit, Shortstop, and swim over. We're getting ready for lunch." Thus began our shared obsession with this tub for a boat, and, more important, with the sea in which we floated her. For Violet, it was more like an infatuation. She looked upon boating as light-hearted romance. She needed fair weather and ongoing fun for it to work. For Stanley and me, being on our boat in the sea turned out to be just another shared passion we had, akin to the one we had for playing Ravel at full volume. You see, once the boat addiction gets into your blood, the craving for it needs to be satisfied, no matter what the weather. We spent every weekend that summer on our boat. I learned everything I could about how to handle her. And while my parents drank most of their days away with other boaties that they met, I set out to explore Catalina Island.